I was sitting in my ice fishing shack on a frozen Saturday morning in January, watching my tip-up flags and nursing a thermos of coffee, when I heard someone pounding on the aluminum door hard enough to make the whole structure shake. The interruption startled me so badly that I nearly knocked over my portable heater, and I could hear my fishing line singing as something tugged at it below the ice. Before I could even get to my feet, a shrill voice cut through the morning silence like nails on a chalkboard. "Open this door right now. You are in violation of Pinewood Estates HOA regulations, and I am calling the police." I sat there for a moment, genuinely confused. Pinewood Estates was the housing development where I lived in northern Minnesota, about 2 miles from where I currently sat on the ice. My property backed up to this lake, but the lake itself was entirely on my own land, a fact that had been the selling point when I bought the place 3 years ago. The previous owner had been an avid fisherman who specifically chose this lot because it included the entire 12-acre lake, and I had fallen in love with it for the same reason. I had checked and double-checked the property survey before closing on the house, making absolutely certain that the lake was mine and mine alone. I opened the door to find a woman in her mid-50s, wearing a puffy purple parka that looked like it cost more than my truck payment. Her blonde hair was styled in that classic speak-to-the-manager cut, and her face was twisted into an expression of absolute fury. She had her phone pressed to her ear with one manicured hand, while the other clutched a leather-bound notebook that I recognized as the HOA Regulation Handbook. "Are you the homeowner?" she demanded, not waiting for me to answer. "I am Barbara Hendricks, president of the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association, and you are in direct violation of Section 12, subsection 4, paragraph 3 of our community standards. Recreational structures must be approved by the board before installation, and ice fishing shanties are expressly prohibited on community property." I took a deep breath of the cold morning air and tried to keep my voice calm. "Ma'am, I appreciate your dedication to the HOA, but this lake is on my private property. It is not community property." "The entire lake is within my property boundaries." Barbara's eyes narrowed dangerously. "That is absolutely false. All bodies of water within Pinewood Estates are community resources, as clearly stated in the HOA covenant. I have already called the police, and they will be here shortly to remove you from this location." I could not believe what I was hearing. "Did you actually read the property survey?" "My lot includes this entire lake. I own it. The HOA has no jurisdiction here." "Young man," she said, and I was 38 years old, so that was generous. "I have been the HOA president for 7 years, and I know every inch of this community. This lake is shared property, and your blatant disregard for our rules is exactly the kind of behavior that brings down property values for everyone." Before I could respond, I heard the crunch of tires on snow and saw a sheriff's department SUV pulling up on the shore about 50 yards away. Barbara's face lit up with vindictive satisfaction. "Finally, officer, over here. This man is trespassing on community property." I watched as a deputy climbed out of the vehicle, and my tension eased slightly when I recognized him. Deputy Marcus Chen and I had gone to high school together, and while we were not close friends, we had always gotten along well. He had moved back to our hometown of Cross Lake, Minnesota, about 5 years ago after serving in the Army, and I ran into him occasionally at the local hardware store or gas station. Marcus walked carefully across the ice, his boots crunching in the thin layer of snow. "Morning, folks. I got a call about a trespassing dispute." "Officer, thank goodness you are here," Barbara said, stepping forward and nearly losing her footing on the slick surface. "This man has erected an illegal structure on community property and refuses to remove it." As HOA president, I am formally requesting that you remove him from this location and cite him for trespassing. Marcus looked at me, and I could see the question in his eyes. Hey, Jake. What is going on here? Hey, Marcus. This is Barbara, the HOA president. She seems to think this lake is community property, but as you probably know, it is entirely on my land. I bought the place specifically because the lake was included in the lot. Barbara made an exasperated sound. He keeps saying that, but it is simply not true. All water features in Pinewood Estates are community resources. It is in the covenant. Marcus pulled out a small notebook. Okay, let me get some information here. Ma'am, what is your full name and address? Barbara Jean Hendricks, 1247 Pinewood Circle. I am the HOA president, and I am acting in my official capacity to enforce our community standards. And Jake, you are at 1556 Lakeview Drive, correct? That is right, I confirmed. Marcus looked around at the lake, then back at the shore where my property line began. Ma'am, I am pretty sure this lake is on private property. I have been out here fishing with Jake before, and he showed me the survey. Barbara's face flushed an angry red. That is impossible. Are you telling me you are friends with this rule breaker? I demand an impartial officer. Marcus's expression hardened slightly. Ma'am, I am being completely impartial. I am telling you what I know about the property boundaries in this area, but if you would like, we can verify it right now. Jake, do you have your property survey available? I have got a copy in the shack, I said, relieved. Give me just a second. I ducked back inside my fishing shack, which was actually a pretty nice setup. I had built it myself the previous winter, an 8x10 structure with insulated walls, a propane heater, 2 fishing holes, a comfortable bench, and even a small shelf for supplies. I kept important documents in a waterproof box, including my property survey, just in case something like this ever happened. I grabbed the rolled-up survey and brought it back outside. Marcus spread the survey out on the hood of a nearby ATV that I had driven out onto the ice. Barbara crowded in close, her eyes scanning the document with increasing disbelief. The survey clearly showed my property lines, and the lake was unquestionably within those boundaries. The measurements were precise, the boundaries were marked, and there was no ambiguity whatsoever. This must be a forgery, Barbara said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. The HOA was never informed of any private lake within our community boundaries. That is because the lake is not within the HOA boundaries, I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. My property backs up to the development, but this entire lake and about 2 acres of land around it are mine. The HOA jurisdiction ends at my property line, which is clearly marked by those posts with the orange tape. I pointed to the shore, where survey markers were indeed visible every 100 feet or so, marking the boundary between my land and the nearest HOA-controlled properties. Marcus straightened up and turned to Barbara. Ma'am, this survey is legitimate. It has got the county stamp, the surveyor's seal, and everything else it needs. This lake is private property, and Mr. Thompson has every right to have his fishing shack here. You are actually currently standing on his property without permission. Barbara's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. But the HOA covenant clearly states that all members must have any recreational structures approved before installation. That applies to HOA property and to structures on member lots that are visible from the street or neighboring properties, Marcus explained patiently. But Mr. Thompson can do whatever he wants on his private land as long as it meets county codes. The HOA has no authority here. This is outrageous, Barbara sputtered. I will be taking this up with our HOA attorney. There must be some legal recourse for this violation of community standards. Ma'am, there is no violation, Marcus said, his voice taking on a firmer tone. And I need to inform you that you are currently trespassing on private property. Mr. Thompson, do you want to press charges? I hesitated. Part of me wanted to just let it go and get back to my fishing, but another part of me knew that if I did not establish boundaries now, Barbara would continue to make my life miserable. She had a reputation in the neighborhood for being relentless when she thought someone was breaking the rules, and I had heard horror stories from other residents about her surprise inspections and citation notices for things like grass being a quarter-inch too long or garbage cans being visible from the street 5 minutes before the designated time. I do not want to press charges, I said finally, but I would appreciate it if she left my property and did not come back without permission. Marcus nodded and turned to Barbara. Ma'am, I am going to issue you a trespass warning. This means that if you come onto Mr. Thompson's property again without his explicit permission, you can be arrested for criminal trespass. Do you understand? Barbara looked like she had been slapped. You cannot be serious. I am the HOA president. I have a responsibility to monitor community compliance. Not on private property, you don't, Marcus said firmly. He pulled out a form from his jacket and began filling it out. I need to see your driver's license, please. Barbara fumbled in her designer purse and produced her license with shaking hands. I could see her mind racing, trying to find some angle or argument that would turn this situation around, but Marcus was professional and thorough as he documented the trespass warning. He handed her a copy of the form and kept one for his records. This is discrimination, Barbara said, her voice rising. You are targeting me because I am trying to maintain property values in our community. I will be filing a complaint with your supervisor about your unprofessional behavior and your obvious bias. Marcus's expression did not change. That is your right, ma'am. The number for our department is on the card I gave you. Now, I need you to leave this property immediately. Barbara looked at me, her eyes full of venom. This is not over. The HOA board will be hearing about this, and we will find a way to deal with your disregard for our community standards. She turned and stalked away across the ice, moving faster than was probably safe given the slippery conditions. Marcus and I watched her reach the shore, climb into a silver Mercedes SUV, and drive away with more speed than was necessary, her tires spinning in the snow. Sorry about that, Jake, Marcus said, shaking his head. Barbara has been a problem around here for a while. We get calls about her harassing residents at least once a month. Seriously? I asked, surprised. She actually does this to other people? Oh yeah. Last month she called us because someone had a political sign in their yard that she disagreed with. Before that, it was someone who painted their front door a color that was not on the HOA-approved list. She has even tried to fine people for having cars in their driveways overnight, even though there is nothing in the actual HOA covenant that prohibits it. I shook my head in disbelief. How did someone like that become HOA president? Marcus laughed without humor. She ran unopposed for the last 3 elections. Nobody else wants the job, and most people just try to stay under her radar. But between you and me, you might want to attend the next HOA meeting and see if you can rally some of your neighbors. I have heard a lot of people are pretty fed up with her. I might just do that, I said. Thanks for handling this, Marcus. I really appreciate it. No problem, that is what we are here for. He glanced at my fishing shack. How is the fishing today? Actually, I had a bite right before Barbara showed up. I have not even checked my lines yet. Well, I will let you get back to it. If Barbara gives you any more trouble, just give us a call. And hey, if you ever want company out here, let me know. I have got a day off next week, and I would love to get some fishing in. You are on, I said. I will text you. After Marcus left, I climbed back into my shack and checked my lines. Sure enough, I had a nice walleye on one of them, probably a 3-pounder. I brought it up through the hole, admired it for a moment, and added it to my cooler. The interruption with Barbara had killed some of my peaceful morning mood, But gradually, the quiet and the gentle tug of the fishing line helped me relax again. I spent another few hours on the ice, catching 2 more walleye and a northern pike that I released because it was under the size limit. By the time I packed up my gear and headed back to shore, the sun was high in the sky and the temperature had risen to an almost balmy 25 degrees. I loaded everything onto my ATV and drove across the ice to my property, where I had a cleared path leading up to my garage. My house was a modest 3-bedroom ranch that I had purchased after my divorce 3 years ago. It was nothing fancy, but it was mine, and I had poured a lot of work into fixing it up. The previous owner had let some things slide, but I had repaired the roof, updated the kitchen, and refinished the hardwood floors. The best feature, by far, was the wall of windows in the living room that looked out over the lake. On summer evenings, I could sit on my deck and watch the sunset reflect off the water, and in winter, I could watch the ice fishermen, which was usually just me, from the warmth of my house. I cleaned my fish in the garage, wrapped the fillets, and put them in the freezer. I was just washing my hands when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my neighbor Tom Harrison, who lived 3 houses down from me within the Pinewood Estates development proper. "Hey Tom, what is up?" "Jake. Did you really get into it with Barbara Hendricks this morning? The HOA email list is absolutely blowing up right now." I groaned. Of course Barbara had sent out an email blast. "Yeah, she showed up at my ice fishing shack claiming I was trespassing on community property. She called the cops and everything." Tom laughed so hard I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "Oh man, that is perfect. What happened?" I gave him the short version of the morning's events, including the trespass warning that Marcus had issued. Tom's laughter got even louder. "This is the best thing I have heard all year," he said. "Barbara sent out this long email about how you were violating community standards and how she was going to have your fishing shack removed, but she conveniently left out the part about getting a trespass warning. Half the neighborhood is responding asking for more details." "Great," I said. "That is just what I need to be the center of HOA drama." "Dude, you are my hero," Tom said. "Do you know how many people have wanted to stand up to Barbara but were too afraid she would make their lives hell? You just became a legend." "I did not mean to become a legend. I just wanted to fish in peace on my own property." "Well, either way, you should probably come to the next HOA meeting. It is this Thursday at 7, and I guarantee Barbara is going to bring this up. You might want to get ahead of it and tell your side of the story." I sighed. I had been avoiding HOA meetings like the plague since I moved in, mostly because they sounded incredibly boring and Barbara had a reputation for dragging them out for hours. But Tom was probably right. If I did not show up and defend myself, Barbara would spin the narrative however she wanted. "All right, I will be there," I said. "Can I count on you for moral support?" "Absolutely. I will even bring my wife. She has been wanting to give Barbara a piece of her mind for months." After I hung up with Tom, I spent the rest of the afternoon doing chores around the house and trying not to think about the HOA drama. But my phone kept buzzing with text messages from neighbors I barely knew, asking about what had happened and offering their support. Apparently, Barbara's reign of terror had affected more people than I realized, and they saw me as some kind of folk hero for standing up to her. By Sunday evening, I had received over 24 messages, including one from a guy named Pete who lived on the other side of the development. He told me that Barbara had threatened to fine him $500 because his mailbox post was painted white instead of the HOA-approved color of forest green, even though his mailbox post had been white for 15 years before Barbara became president. Another neighbor, Sharon, said Barbara had tried to ban her from having flowers in her front yard because they were not on the approved plant list, despite the fact that they were native wildflowers that were actually better for the environment than the ornamental shrubs Barbara preferred. The more I heard, the angrier I got. Barbara was not protecting property values or maintaining community standards. She was on a power trip, plain and simple, and she was making everyone's lives miserable in the process. Monday morning, I went to work at the construction company where I was a project manager. I spent the day coordinating subcontractors and reviewing blueprints for a new commercial building in Brainerd, trying to focus on my job instead of the HOA situation. But during my lunch break, I got a call from an unknown number. "Hello. Is this Jacob Thompson?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, this is Jake. Who is calling?" "My name is Linda Foster. I am a member of the Pinewood Estates HOA board, and I wanted to reach out to you privately about the incident this weekend." I felt my guard go up. "Okay, what about it?" Linda's voice was apologetic. "First, I want to say that I am sorry about how Barbara handled the situation. She had no right to confront you like that, and she certainly should not have called the police on you when you were on your own property. I wanted you to know that not everyone on the board supports her behavior." "I appreciate that," I said, surprised. To be honest, I was expecting the whole board to close ranks around her. "Some of them might," Linda admitted, "but there are a few of us who have been concerned about Barbara's actions for a while now. She has been overstepping her authority, and frankly, she is making enemies out of the very people we are supposed to be serving. I wanted to give you a heads up that she is planning to make a big deal out of this at Thursday's meeting. She is going to try to paint you as a troublemaker who is refusing to follow community rules." "But I was not even on community property," I protested. "The lake is mine." "I know that, and you know that, but Barbara is going to try to confuse the issue. She has already been talking about how you are setting a bad example, and how other residents might think they can ignore HOA rules too. It does not make any logical sense, but she is really good at getting people worked up." "So what should I do?" Linda was quiet for a moment. "Come to the meeting. Bring your property survey and any other documentation you have. Be calm, be factual, and do not let her bait you into an argument. And if you are interested, there are a number of us who would like to see some changes in the HOA leadership. Barbara's term as president ends in April, and we are going to need someone to run against her." "Are you volunteering?" I asked. "I am thinking about it," Linda said. "But it would help to have more support from the community. Anyway, I just wanted to reach out and let you know you are not alone in this." "Thanks, Linda. I really appreciate it." The next few days passed slowly. I went to work, came home, and tried to prepare myself mentally for the Thursday meeting. I made copies of my property survey and printed out the relevant county records showing the lake boundaries. I even looked up Minnesota state law regarding HOA authority, just to make sure I had all my facts straight. On Thursday evening, I drove to the Pinewood Estates Community Center, a small building near the development's entrance that was used for HOA meetings and the occasional neighborhood party. The parking lot was packed, which was unusual. Tom had told me that most meetings only drew about 10 or 15 people, but there had to be at least 50 cars here tonight. I walked inside and found the meeting room absolutely crammed with people. Every chair was taken, and residents were standing along the walls and in the back. The room buzzed with conversation, and I could feel the tension in the air. Tom waved at me from the third row, and I squeezed through the crowd to sit next to him and his wife, Kelly. "Told you this would be interesting," Tom said with a grin. "I have never seen this many people at an HOA meeting in my life." At the front of the room, Barbara sat at a table with 4 other board members. She looked composed and confident, her hair perfectly styled and her makeup flawless. She wore a navy blue blazer and a strand of pearls, and she had a stack of papers in front of her that she kept organizing and reorganizing. At exactly 7 o'clock, Barbara called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of a gavel. "Good evening, everyone. I am pleased to see such a strong turnout tonight. It shows that our community members care deeply about maintaining the high standards that make Pinewood Estates such a desirable place to live." There were a few murmurs of agreement, but most people just waited to see where this was going. Barbara went through the usual boring agenda items first, including approval of the previous meeting's minutes and a financial report from the treasurer. Then she cleared her throat and looked directly at me. "Now, we need to address a serious matter that occurred this past weekend. It has come to my attention that one of our residents has been flagrantly disregarding HOA regulations and has even involved law enforcement in what should have been a simple community matter." I felt everyone's eyes turn toward me, and I kept my expression neutral. "On Saturday morning," Barbara continued, "I discovered an illegal ice fishing structure on what I believe to be community property. When I attempted to address this violation with the homeowner, he became argumentative and refused to cooperate. I was forced to call the sheriff's department for assistance." She paused dramatically, looking around the room. What happened next was a shocking display of disrespect for our community standards. Instead of acknowledging his violation, this resident convinced the responding officer to issue me a trespass warning, essentially banning me from doing my job as your HOA president. The room erupted in conversation. Some people looked shocked while others looked confused. I could see Linda Foster, who I now recognized as the woman sitting 2 seats down from Barbara, shaking her head in frustration. Barbara held up her hand for silence. "I believe this sets a dangerous precedent. If residents feel they can simply ignore our rules and regulations without consequence, then what is the point of having an HOA at all? Our property values depend on everyone following the same standards and maintaining the appearance and character of our community." Tom leaned over and whispered, "She is not even mentioning that the lake is your property." "I noticed," I whispered back. A man in the front row raised his hand. "Barbara, can you clarify something? Where exactly was this fishing shack located?" Barbara's smile tightened. "It was on the lake behind Mr. Thompson's property." "So, on the lake itself?" The man pressed. "Not on his yard or anything like that?" "That is correct." Linda Foster spoke up from her seat at the board table. "Barbara, I think we need to provide the full context here. Can you explain the ownership of that lake?" Barbara's face flushed slightly. "The lake is within the general boundaries of Pinewood Estates." "That is not what I asked," Linda said firmly. "Does the HOA own that lake?" The room went silent. Everyone was watching the exchange with rapt attention. "The lake is a community resource," Barbara said, sounding defensive. "All bodies of water within our development are meant to be enjoyed by all residents." "That is not true," Linda said, and I was grateful for her intervention. "The lake in question is entirely on Mr. Thompson's private property. It is not owned by the HOA, it is not a community resource, and we have absolutely no authority over what he does on it." The room erupted again, this time with people talking over each other and asking questions. I could hear snippets of conversation. "I thought all the lakes were community property. How can someone own an entire lake?" Wait, so Barbara was in the wrong. Barbara's face had gone from flushed to bright red. "That is a matter of interpretation. The HOA covenant clearly states that all recreational structures must be approved by the board." "On HOA property," Linda interrupted, "or on individual lots where the structures are visible from common areas, Mr. Thompson's lake is neither. Barbara, you know this. You were wrong and you need to admit it." I decided it was time to speak up. I stood and held up a hand. "Excuse me, can I say something?" Barbara looked like she wanted to refuse, but with the entire room watching, she had no choice. "Fine. Mr. Thompson, please address your comments to the board. I took a deep breath and tried to keep my voice calm and factual. My name is Jake Thompson, and I live at 1556 Lakeview Drive. When I purchased my property 3 years ago, one of the main reasons I chose it was because it included a private 12-acre lake. I have the property survey, county records, and title documents that all confirm this lake is entirely within my property boundaries. The HOA has no ownership stake in it and no authority over it. I pulled out the copies of my survey and held them up. I have brought copies of the documentation if anyone wants to see them. On Saturday morning, I was ice fishing on my own property when Mrs. Hendricks came out onto the lake and accused me of trespassing. She called the sheriff's department, and when Deputy Chen arrived, he confirmed that the lake is indeed my property. Mrs. Hendricks was issued a trespass warning because she was on my land without permission. A woman in the back raised her hand. So you are saying the HOA president was trespassing on your property and she called the cops on you? That is exactly what happened, I confirmed. The room buzzed with conversation again, and I could see people passing around the copies of my survey. Barbara looked like she was about to explode, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. This is ridiculous, Barbara snapped. The point is not whether the lake is technically private property. The point is that Mr. Thompson's attitude represents a larger problem in this community. He clearly has no respect for the HOA or for the work we do to maintain property values. If we allow this kind of behavior to continue, it will only encourage others to disregard our rules. Tom stood up, unable to contain himself any longer. Barbara, that makes no sense at all. Jake was not disregarding any rules because there are no rules that apply to his private property. You are the one who was in the wrong here, and now you are trying to turn it around and make him look bad because you are embarrassed that you got caught overstepping your authority. Several people applauded, and Barbara's face somehow got even redder. Mr. Harrison, you are out of order. This is not a forum for personal attacks. It is not a personal attack, Tom shot back. It is a fact. And while we are on the subject, I think we should talk about all the other times you have overstepped your authority. Like when you threatened to fine me because my kids left their bikes in the driveway overnight. Or when you sent Sharon Mitchell a citation because she planted native wildflowers in her yard. Or when you tried to tell Pete Rodriguez that he had to repaint his mailbox post even though it has been the same color for 15 years. More people started calling out their own stories of Barbara's overreach. I heard at least a dozen different complaints, ranging from ridiculous to outright harassment. Barbara tried to call for order, banging her gavel repeatedly, but the room had turned into chaos. Finally, Linda Foster stood up and spoke in a voice that somehow cut through the noise. Everyone, please, let us handle this in an orderly fashion. Barbara, I am calling for a vote of no confidence in your leadership as HOA president. The room went silent again. Barbara stared at Linda in shock. You cannot do that. Actually, I can, Linda said, pulling out a copy of the HOA bylaws. According to Article 7, Section 2, any board member can call for a vote of no confidence if they believe the president is not acting in the best interests of the community. The vote requires a 2/3 majority of present board members to pass. Barbara looked at the other 3 board members, her expression somewhere between panic and fury. This is a coup. You are trying to remove me because I have the courage to enforce the rules that everyone else is too weak to uphold. One of the other board members, an older man named George, spoke up. Barbara, I have supported you for a long time, but Linda is right. You have been overstepping your authority for months, and it is creating problems for everyone. I think it is time for new leadership. I agree, said the 4th board member, a younger woman named Patricia. The treasurer, a man named David, looked uncomfortable but finally nodded. I am sorry, Barbara, but I agree too. I vote in favor of the no confidence motion. Linda looked at Barbara. That is 4 out of 5 board members. The motion passes. Barbara, you are removed as president effective immediately. The board will hold a special election to choose a new president at our next meeting. For a moment, I thought Barbara might actually have a stroke. Her face went from red to purple, and her hands shook as she gripped the table. Then she stood up, sweeping her papers into her designer bag. You have not heard the last of this, she said, her voice shaking with rage. I will be contacting our attorney, and I will be fighting this illegal removal. All of you will regret this decision. She stormed out of the room, and the door slammed behind her with enough force to rattle the pictures on the walls. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then someone in the back started clapping, and within seconds the entire room erupted in applause. Linda smiled and held up her hands for quiet. All right, everyone. Let us take a brief recess and then reconvene to discuss the next steps. Jake, thank you for bringing this issue to light. I think you just helped our community more than you realize. During the recess, I was surrounded by neighbors thanking me and asking questions about the lake. I showed several people the property survey, and they were amazed by how much land I actually owned. Tom clapped me on the back and said, I told you that you were a legend. When the meeting reconvened, Linda was voted in as the interim president, and she immediately made several announcements. First, the board would be reviewing all of the citations and fines that Barbara had issued over the past year to determine which ones were legitimate and which ones needed to be rescinded. Second, they would be holding a series of community forums to get input on how to improve the HOA and make it more responsive to residents' needs. And third, they would be revising the enforcement procedures to prevent future abuses of power. I left the meeting feeling exhausted but satisfied. What had started as a peaceful Saturday morning of ice fishing had turned into a full-blown HOA revolution, and I had somehow become the catalyst for change. Over the next few weeks, things settled into a new normal. Linda proved to be a much more reasonable and fair HOA president, and she rescinded several of Barbara's more ridiculous citations, including Tom's bike violation and Sharon's wildflower citation. The HOA even issued a formal apology to Pete Rodriguez for the mailbox post incident. Barbara, true to her word, did contact an attorney and threatened to sue both the HOA and me personally. However, her attorney apparently took one look at the facts of the case and advised her that she had no legal grounds for a lawsuit. She sent one more threatening letter and then went silent. I continued to enjoy my ice fishing throughout the rest of the winter. Marcus came out a few times, and we had some great conversations while waiting for the fish to bite. He told me that Barbara had indeed filed a complaint against him with the sheriff's department, but his supervisor had reviewed the incident report and body camera footage and determined that Marcus had handled the situation appropriately. The complaint was dismissed. In late February, I was out on the ice on a Sunday afternoon when I noticed someone walking toward my shack from the shore. My first thought was that Barbara was back for round 2, but as the figure got closer, I realized it was Linda Foster. "Hi, Jake," she called out. "Do you have a minute?" "Sure, come on in," I said, opening the door to my shack. "What is up?" Linda stepped inside and looked around with interest. "Nice setup you have got here." "Anyway, I wanted to talk to you about something. As you know, we are having elections for HOA board positions in April, and several of us have been talking. We think you would make a great addition to the board." I was caught completely off guard. "Me? Why would I want to be on the HOA board?" "Because you care about fairness and doing the right thing," Linda said. "And because you are not afraid to stand up for yourself and your neighbors. We need people like that, especially after the Barbara situation. You do not have to be president or anything like that, just a regular board member." We meet once a month, and it is usually only about an hour unless there is something major going on. I thought about it. A month ago, I would have said absolutely not. But after seeing how much damage one person on a power trip could do, and after seeing how much the community needed reasonable voices, I found myself reconsidering. "Can I think about it?" I asked. "Of course," Linda said. "Just let me know by mid-March if you want your name on the ballot." After Linda left, I sat in my shack and watched my tip-up flags for a while, thinking about everything that had happened. I had moved to this house looking for peace and quiet, a place where I could fish and relax and not have to deal with drama. Instead, I had ended up at the center of an HOA uprising. But maybe that was not such a bad thing. Maybe it was important to get involved, to make sure that the community was run by people who actually cared about their neighbors, instead of just enforcing rules for the sake of enforcing rules. I pulled out my phone and texted Linda. "I will do it. Put my name on the ballot." Her response came back almost immediately. "Fantastic, welcome to the team." In early March, I got a strange call from the county sheriff's department. It was not Marcus this time, but a detective named Sarah Rodriguez. "Mr. Thompson, I am calling about Barbara Hendricks. We received a complaint from several of your neighbors that she has been engaging in some concerning behavior, and I wanted to get your statement about your interactions with her." "What kind of concerning behavior?" I asked, worried. "We have had reports that she has been driving slowly past neighbors' houses at odd hours, taking photographs of their properties, and in some cases, entering yards without permission to look for violations. One resident reported that she found Mrs. Hendricks in her backyard at 6 in the morning, measuring the height of her fence. I felt a chill run down my spine. That is really creepy." "It is also potentially criminal," Detective Rodriguez said. "Depending on the circumstances, it could be trespassing, stalking, or harassment. Can you tell me about your interactions with her?" I gave Detective Rodriguez a full account of the ice fishing incident and the trespass warning that Marcus had issued. I also mentioned the threatening letters that Barbara had sent after being removed as HOA president. "Thank you, that is very helpful," Detective Rodriguez said. "We are gathering statements from multiple residents, and we will be having a conversation with Mrs. Hendricks about her behavior. If she contacts you again or comes onto your property, please call us immediately." "I will," I promised. 2 weeks later, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Barbara had been arrested. Apparently, after Detective Rodriguez spoke with her, Barbara had become even more unhinged. She had gone to Sharon Mitchell's house in the middle of the night and spray-painted "HOA violations will not be tolerated" on Sharon's garage door. A neighbor had seen her do it and called the police, and Barbara was arrested for criminal mischief and trespassing. The story made the local news, and I watched the segment with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Barbara had clearly let her need for control consume her to the point where she was breaking the law herself. She was facing misdemeanor charges, and the news reporter mentioned that several neighbors were pursuing restraining orders against her. Tom called me right after the news segment aired. "Did you see it? Barbara got arrested." "I saw it," I said. "It is kind of sad, actually. She completely destroyed her life over the HOA." "She destroyed other people's lives too," Tom pointed out. "Sharon is still trying to get the spray paint off her garage door. Don't feel too bad for Barbara. She brought this on herself." He was right, of course. Barbara had been given multiple opportunities to change her behavior, but she had doubled down instead. Now she was facing the consequences of her actions. The HOA elections were held in early April, and I was voted onto the board along with several other new members. Linda was officially elected as president, and one of the first things we did was adopt a new code of conduct for board members that emphasized respect, fairness, and transparency. We also established an appeals process so that residents could challenge citations they believed were unfair. Barbara's criminal case went to court in May. I did not attend the hearing, but I heard from Tom that she had pleaded guilty to criminal mischief and trespassing. She was sentenced to probation, community service, and was ordered to pay restitution to Sharon for the damage to her garage door. She was also required to attend anger management classes. A few weeks after the sentencing, I saw Barbara at the grocery store in town. She was by herself, pushing a cart slowly down the cereal aisle. She looked older and more tired than I remembered, and her hair was no longer perfectly styled. When she saw me, she froze for a moment, and I could see the conflict in her eyes. For a second, I thought about just walking past her and pretending I had not seen her, but something made me stop. I pushed my cart over to her and said, "Hello, Barbara." She looked startled, as if she could not believe I was actually speaking to her. "Hello," she said quietly. There was an awkward silence, and then Barbara said, "I suppose you heard about the court case." "I did," I said. "How are you doing?" She laughed without humor. "That is a complicated question." "I lost my position, my reputation, and most of my friends. I am seeing a therapist now. She says I have control issues stemming from childhood trauma." She shook her head. "I never meant for things to go so far. I just wanted everything to be perfect, you know. I thought if I could control the neighborhood, make sure everything looked perfect and followed the rules, then my life would feel more stable." I did not know what to say to that, so I just nodded. "I owe you an apology," Barbara continued. "What I did to you was wrong. The lake was your property, and I had no right to confront you like that or to call the police. I was so focused on being right that I could not see how unreasonable I was being." "I appreciate you saying that," I said, and I meant it. It took courage to apologize, especially after everything that had happened. "I heard you are on the board now," Barbara said. "I am sure you will do a better job than I did." "We are trying to make things more fair for everyone," I said. "That is really all anyone wanted." Barbara nodded slowly. "Well, good luck, and for what it is worth, I am sorry for everything." She turned and pushed her cart away, leaving me standing in the cereal aisle feeling oddly emotional. I had wanted Barbara to face consequences for her actions, and she had. But seeing her broken and apologetic made me realize that the situation had no real winners. Barbara had lost almost everything. Sharon had to repair her garage, and the whole neighborhood had spent months dealing with stress and drama. Still, as I finished my shopping and drove home, I felt like maybe some good had come out of the whole mess. The HOA was functioning better than it had in years, the community was more engaged, and people felt like their voices mattered. And I had learned that sometimes standing up for yourself, even when it is uncomfortable, is the right thing to do. When I got home, I unpacked my groceries and then walked down to the lake. The ice had melted weeks ago, and the water sparkled in the late afternoon sun. My fishing shack was stored in the garage for the summer, but I had my boat ready to go, and I was looking forward to some evening fishing trips. I stood on the shore for a while, just appreciating the view and the quiet. This was why I had bought this property in the first place. Not to get into fights with the HOA or to become some kind of neighborhood hero, but just to have a peaceful place where I could fish and relax and enjoy nature. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Hey, want to go fishing next weekend? I finally got that Saturday off." I smiled and texted back, "Absolutely, bring your gear and plan to stay all day." As I walked back to the house, I thought about how much had changed in just a few months. I had gone from being a guy who just wanted to be left alone to someone who was actively involved in his community. I had made new friends, stood up to a bully, and helped bring about real change in the neighborhood. And through it all, I still had my lake, my fishing, and my peace and quiet. In the end, that was what really mattered. The following months brought a sense of normalcy that I had not experienced since moving to Pinewood Estates. The HOA board meetings were productive and civil, and Linda ran them with an efficiency and fairness that made me wonder how we had ever put up with Barbara's dictatorial style. We tackled real issues like road maintenance, snow removal, and updating the community playground rather than wasting time on petty violations and power games. In June, Tom and Kelly invited me to a neighborhood barbecue at their house. It was a warm Saturday evening, and it seemed like half the development had shown up. People were grilling burgers and hot dogs. Kids were running around playing tag, and someone had set up a volleyball net in the backyard. Sharon Mitchell approached me with a beer in hand and a warm smile. "Jake, I never got a chance to properly thank you. If you had not stood up to Barbara that day on the lake, I think she would have just kept getting worse. You probably saved me from having my whole yard dug up because she decided my flowers were unauthorized or something." I laughed and accepted the beer she handed me. I just wanted to fish in peace. I had no idea it would turn into such a big thing. "Well, either way, I am grateful," Sharon said. "We all are. You showed us that we did not have to just put up with being bullied." As the evening wore on, I found myself talking with neighbors I had barely known before. Pete Rodriguez told me about his plans to finally renovate his kitchen now that he was not worried about Barbara showing up to inspect his paint colors. A young couple who had just moved in asked me about fishing on the area lakes, and I ended up inviting them to come out to my lake sometime. Linda found me as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across Tom's yard. "How are you settling into the board role?" she asked. "It is not as bad as I thought it would be," I admitted. "I actually kind of enjoy it. It feels good to be part of something that actually helps people instead of just creating problems." "That is exactly the attitude we need," Linda said. "You know, we are going to need to elect officers again next spring. Have you given any thought to running for a leadership position?" I held up my hands in mock surrender. "Whoa, let me get through a full year as a regular board member first. I am not ready to be president or anything like that," Linda laughed. "Fair enough, but keep it in mind. You have got a good head on your shoulders and people trust you." As I drove home that night, I felt more connected to my community than I ever had before. I had moved here after my divorce looking for a fresh start and a quiet life, and I had found both of those things. But I had also found something I had not expected, a sense of belonging and purpose. The summer passed pleasantly. I spent most weekends fishing, either on my lake or on one of the larger lakes nearby. Marcus and I became regular fishing buddies, and he introduced me to a few other guys who shared our interest. We formed an informal fishing club and started planning a trip to Lake of the Woods for the following year. In August, I was working in my garage when a car pulled into my driveway. I did not recognize the vehicle, a newer Honda sedan, and I felt a brief moment of tension wondering if it was somehow Barbara-related. But when the driver got out, I saw it was a man in his 30s wearing khakis and a polo shirt. "Are you Jake Thompson?" he asked. "That is me. What can I do for you?" He extended his hand with a friendly smile. "My name is David Chen. I am Marcus's brother. He told me you have a private lake, and I was wondering if you would be willing to let me do some environmental sampling here. I am a biologist with the Minnesota DNR, and we are doing a study on the health of small private lakes in this region." "Environmental sampling?" I asked. "What does that involve?" "Mostly just water quality testing and fish surveys," David explained. "We would come out a few times over the next year, take some water samples, maybe do some net sampling to see what kinds of fish are living here and their overall health. It is completely non-invasive, and you would get a full report on the ecological health of your lake." "That actually sounds pretty interesting," I said. Yeah, sure, you can do your study here. David's face lit up. Really, that is fantastic. A lot of private landowners are not interested in participating, but this kind of data is really valuable for understanding how Minnesota's aquatic ecosystems are changing. He pulled out some paperwork, and I signed a permission form allowing the DNR access to my lake for research purposes. David explained that they would probably start sampling in the fall and continue through the following summer. You know, David said as he was leaving, Marcus told me about the whole HOA situation. That was pretty wild. My wife is on our HOA board in the Twin Cities, and she said it is a constant battle to keep things reasonable and prevent power-hungry people from taking over. Sounds about right, I said. We got lucky that enough people were willing to stand up and make a change. True to his word, David came back in September with a team of researchers. They spent several hours on my lake, taking water samples from different depths and locations, checking water temperature and clarity, and documenting the types of aquatic plants growing in the shallows. I watched from my deck, fascinated by the scientific process. When they were done, David came up to the house to brief me on their preliminary findings. Your lake is in really good shape, he said. The water quality is excellent, the pH is right where it should be, and we saw evidence of a healthy and diverse fish population. Whatever you are doing, keep doing it. I am not really doing anything, I said, just fishing and leaving it alone. That is probably the best thing you can do, David said. A lot of private lake owners want to modify everything, add chemicals to control weeds, stock non-native fish species, or build too many structures that disrupt the natural ecosystem. Your lake is thriving because you are letting it be a lake. That made me feel good. I had always tried to be a responsible steward of my property, but it was nice to have scientific confirmation that I was doing the right thing. As fall arrived and the leaves started to change colors, I prepared for another ice fishing season. I did some maintenance on my shack, replaced the propane tank, and made sure my fishing gear was in good shape. I also went to the sporting goods store in Brainerd and picked up a new ice auger, since my old one was getting worn out. The first real cold snap came in late November, and by early December, the ice was thick enough to safely support my weight. I ventured out onto the lake carefully, drilling test holes and checking the ice thickness. Once I was confident it was safe, I drove my ATV out and set up my fishing shack in the same spot I had used the previous year. On my first full day of ice fishing that season, I caught a beautiful northern pike that must have been close to 30 inches long. I took a photo of it before releasing it back into the water, watching it disappear into the dark depths below the ice. As I sat in my shack that afternoon, warm and comfortable while the wind howled outside, I thought about everything that had happened since the last ice fishing season. I had been transformed from a solitary guy who just wanted to be left alone into someone who was actively engaged in his community. I had made friends, stood up to a bully, and helped bring about positive change. But I had also learned something important about myself. I learned that I was capable of standing up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable or scary. I learned that sometimes the best way to have a quiet life is to make sure your community is functional and fair. And I learned that isolation is not the same thing as peace. My phone rang, breaking my contemplation. It was Linda. Hey, Jake, sorry to bother you. I know you are probably out fishing, but I wanted to give you a heads up about something. Barbara is moving out of Pinewood Estates. Really? I said, surprised. Where is she going? Apparently she bought a condo in Florida. She is leaving next week. I just thought you would want to know since you were so directly involved in everything that happened. How do you feel about it? I asked. Linda was quiet for a moment. Honestly, relieved. I know she apologized to some people and has been working on her issues. but I think a fresh start somewhere new is probably the best thing for everyone. She can move on, and we can continue building a healthier community without that history hanging over everything." "That makes sense," I said. "I hope she finds some peace wherever she ends up." "You are a better person than I am," Linda said with a laugh. "Anyway, I will let you get back to your fishing. Catch anything good?" "A nice pike earlier. Probably going to stay out here for a few more hours and see what else is biting." After I hung up, I sat for a while thinking about Barbara. Part of me felt vindicated that she was leaving, but another part of me just felt sad that it had come to this. She had been so consumed by her need for control that she had destroyed her own life and made everyone around her miserable. I hoped that wherever she was going, she would get the help she needed and find a way to be happy without trying to control everything around her. The winter passed much more peacefully than the previous one. I spent countless hours in my fishing shack, sometimes alone and sometimes with friends. Marcus came out regularly, and Tom even joined us a few times, though he admitted that he did not have the patience for ice fishing that Marcus and I did. In February, David Chen came back to do winter sampling on the lake. He brought a team with him, and they drilled holes through the ice to take water samples and check oxygen levels at different depths. I invited them to warm up in my shack afterward, and we talked about the changing climate and how it was affecting Minnesota's lakes. "Your lake is really special," David said. "Most small lakes like this are privately owned, and we never get access to study them. The data we are collecting here is going to be really valuable for our research." "I am glad I could help," I said. "It is pretty cool to know that my lake is contributing to science." As March arrived and the ice started to thin, I began preparing for the transition to open water fishing. I pulled my shack off the ice and stored it in the garage, and I spent a Saturday afternoon getting my boat ready for the season. I replaced the battery, changed the oil in the motor, and gave the whole thing a thorough cleaning. The HOA elections were coming up again, and Linda had asked me if I wanted to run for vice president. After thinking about it for a few days, I decided to go for it. I had learned a lot in my first year on the board, and I felt like I could contribute more in a leadership role. The election was held in early April, and I was elected vice president with a strong majority. Linda was re-elected as president, and several other reasonable, community-minded people filled out the rest of the board. At our first meeting after the election, Linda raised her coffee cup in a toast. "Here is to a year of boring, functional HOA governance," she said. "May we have no drama, no power trips, and no police involvement." Everyone laughed and clinked their cups together. It was funny because it was exactly what we all wanted. An HOA that quietly did its job without making anyone's life harder. As spring turned to summer, I settled into my new role as vice president. It involved a bit more work than being a regular board member, but it was manageable, and I found that I enjoyed the additional responsibility. Linda and I made a good team. She was excellent at the administrative side of things and at managing personalities, while I was better at the practical aspects like coordinating maintenance projects and working with contractors. In May, we organized a community cleanup day where volunteers picked up litter along the roads and in the common areas. Over 50 people showed up, including families with kids, and we got the entire development cleaned up in just a few hours. Afterward, we had a potluck picnic at the community center, and it turned into an impromptu celebration of how far we had come as a community. Tom found me during the picnic and said, "You know, a year ago I never would have come to something like this. I was so fed up with the HOA that I just wanted to ignore it completely. But now it actually feels like we are all part of something positive." "That was always the potential," I said. "We just needed leadership that cared more about the community than about power." As the summer progressed, I spent as much time as possible on the water. I took my boat out most evenings after work, trolling for walleye and bass. Sometimes Marcus would come with me, and we would spend hours on the lake, talking about everything from sports to politics to our hopes for the future. One evening in July, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Marcus said, "You know, I have been thinking about that day with Barbara. When I first got the call about a trespassing dispute, I was expecting it to be some minor thing I could resolve in 5 minutes. I had no idea it was going to turn into such a huge deal." "Neither did I," said. "I just wanted to fish." "But it worked out well, didn't it?" Marcus said. "Your community is better off. Barbara got help that she clearly needed, and you ended up getting involved and making a difference." "I guess so," I said. "Though I still think I would have preferred a quiet day of fishing without all the drama." Marcus laughed. "Yeah, but where is the fun in that?" As the summer ended and fall arrived again, I found myself reflecting on the past year and a half. So much had changed since that Saturday morning when Barbara had pounded on my ice fishing shack door. I had gone from being a loner who avoided community involvement to being the vice president of the HOA. I had made real friendships with my neighbors. I had stood up to a bully and helped create positive change. And through it all, I still had my lake, my fishing, and the peace and quiet that I had been looking for when I bought this property. The difference was that now I understood that peace and quiet do not mean isolation. They mean living in a community where people treat each other with respect and fairness, where conflicts are resolved through honest conversation rather than through power plays and intimidation. In November, as I prepared for another ice fishing season, I got a call from an unfamiliar number with a Florida area code. I almost did not answer it, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hello." "Jake, this is Barbara Hendricks." I was so surprised that I almost dropped the phone. "Barbara, hi, how are you?" "I am doing better," she said, and her voice did sound calmer and more centered than I had ever heard it. "I am calling because I owe you a more complete apology than the one I gave you in the grocery store. I have been working with my therapist, and she suggested that I reach out to the people I hurt and make proper amends." "Okay," I said, not sure where this was going. "What I did to you was wrong on every level," Barbara said. "I invaded your privacy, I tried to use my position to bully you, and I wasted police resources because I was too arrogant to admit I was wrong. You were just trying to enjoy your property and I turned it into a nightmare. I am truly sorry for that." "I appreciate you saying that, Barbara. That means a lot." "I also want you to know that I am getting help," she continued. "I have been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder and some control issues related to childhood trauma. I am on medication now and seeing a therapist regularly. I am starting to understand why I acted the way I did, even though it does not excuse my behavior." "I am glad you are getting help," I said, and I meant it. "That takes courage." "How is the neighborhood?" Barbara asked. "Is Linda doing a good job as president?" "She is doing great," I said. "The HOA is actually functional now, and people are not afraid of getting ridiculous violations anymore." Barbara laughed, though it sounded a bit sad. "I am glad. I really did think I was helping, you know. I thought if I could just make everything perfect, everyone would be happy and property values would go up. But I see now that I was just making everyone miserable, including myself." We talked for a few more minutes, and before we hung up, Barbara said, "Thank you for taking my call, Jake. And thank you for being gracious about everything. You would have been well within your rights to be angry and vindictive, but you were not. That is something I am learning from." After the call ended, I sat for a while processing the conversation. It took real strength for Barbara to make that call and own up to her mistakes. I hoped that she would be able to build a better life for herself in Florida. one where she was not constantly trying to control everything around her. As December arrived and the ice thickened on my lake, I set up my fishing shack for another season. The first Saturday I went out, I invited Tom and Marcus to join me. We spent the afternoon fishing, drinking coffee and telling stories. Tom caught a nice crappie, Marcus got a decent walleye, and I pulled in a northern pike that gave me a good fight before I brought it through the ice. As the sun started to set and we packed up our gear, Tom looked around at the lake and said, "You know, Jake, you have got it pretty good here. Your own private lake, good neighbors, and an HOA that actually functions like it is supposed to." "Yeah," I said, looking out at the ice and the snow-covered shore and the woods beyond. "I really do." As we loaded our gear onto the ATVs and headed back to shore, I thought about everything that had happened to bring me to this point. The conflict with Barbara, the HOA drama, the community transformation, and my own journey from isolation to involvement. It had been a wild ride, but I would not change any of it. Because now, when I sat in my ice fishing shack watching my tip-up flags and listening to the wind, I was not just a guy hiding from the world. I was a member of a community, a friend, a leader, and someone who had learned that standing up for what is right is always worth it, even when it is difficult. The ice creaked and settled beneath me, the heater hummed quietly, and somewhere below the frozen surface, fish moved through the dark water. And I was exactly where I wanted to be.